What's up everybody, Rob here. So, as promised, this is a continuation on my series of videos about early modern warfare. Specifically, today we're going to be looking at armor in the immediate post-medieval period, and this is just a very brief overview of armor that was used during that era, pretty much from about 1500 to roughly 1700 thereabouts. And before I begin, I just want to point out that this is not for experts or people who are very well versed in this subject. This is more for beginners who basically just think, okay, I have a pretty good idea of what warfare was like during the Middle Ages, but what happened immediately after that? So basically, I'm just kind of trying to fill in the gaps as much as possible. If you are looking for a very detailed, experts, opinion of what's going on here, this is probably not the video for you. But if you're just looking for a basic overview from this particular time period, you've come to the right place. Okay, so before we can take a look at the what of armor, the specific types of armor that would be worn during this era, we have to understand the why. So this particular time in history, and not just military sense, but in just, society in general, it was a time of massive upheaval. There were the wars of religion. You have the main schism, well, not the main schism of Christianity, but a major schism in Christianity with the Protestant Reformation. There's also the breakdown of the feudal order and the rise of the nation state, at least as we know it today. More centralized power in control of a single government rather than dispersed amongst feudal overlords. And as well as burgeoning economic systems, basically what would eventually evolve into what we today know as capitalism. So it was basically it's a time of major transition throughout Europe during this era. In addition to this, there were brand new technologies. Now, as far as warfare was concerned, probably the main technology that was a driving force behind shifts in warfare, and in this particular case, shifts in the type of armor that would be worn, would be the use of firearms. The use of firearms led to a massive revolution in warfare. Basically, you can take an untrained peasant, teach them all the steps, and yes, there were a lot of steps, but basically, a random peasant being taught all the steps can simply blow a knight on horseback completely out of the saddle. Not always, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Now, peasant levies have always been used in warfare. That's nothing new. It's just that up to this point, they would be given a polearm of some kind, usually a spear or something like that, and told to stand shoulder to shoulder and point the spear in the general direction of the enemy, and that's pretty much all they would do. But with firearms and the range capabilities of firearms, they can project their force out much, much further, and can actually, these untrained or barely trained peasant levies can be used much more offensively. Now, while firearms and other similar technologies did play a role in the shifts in the types of armor that would be worn, and just warfare in general, there's also something else to consider, and that would be money, because, money makes the world go round. So as the feudal system broke down, governments became more and more centralized. As such, the burden of raising armies fell to the state. Likewise, at this time, armies swelled in size. So, to give you an idea, at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the total number of combatants on the field is anywhere between, 14,000 on the low estimates, possibly all the way up to about 20,000. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, the total number of combatants on both sides was well over 50,000. So instead of the cost of warfare being dispersed over a number of feudal warlords and other individuals like that, instead a single entity, basically a single powerful state, would be in charge of equipping a much larger number of soldiers. And because of the ever-increasing size of armies and men under arms, the government had to come up with a new approach to arm and equip them. Thusly, they created what is known as munitions armor. Up to this point in history, most of the armor and equipment that was provided to soldiers was actually provided by the soldiers themselves, especially the knights in armor that you see throughout the Middle Ages, like the iconic image of the knight in shining plate armor. That was provided for and paid for by the knight themselves. Every individual piece would be custom made for the person who was purchasing it, mostly, again, the landed nobility, and as a result, each piece of armor would be incredibly expensive. But as governments took over the arming and equipping of soldiers, it just became apparent that this particular approach was no longer feasible just from a purely economic standpoint. So munitions-grade armor came into being. Now what that means simply is that it would be mass-produced, or at least mass-produced as you could get, given that we are in a pre-industrial era, with each piece being made according to separate sizes and stockpiled in armories, again, run by the government. And as soldiers would be recruited, or as they would come into the need for this particular armor, these different pieces would be gathered up and given to the individual soldier in question. The metal that would usually be either iron or low-carbon steel. Although it's not nearly as high quality as the steel that would be used for a knight's armor, it was much cheaper and still provided a decent amount of protection. However, as always throughout history, armor and arms were always in a constant arms race with one another. And with the new technology of firearms, armor had to become thicker and thicker in order to provide protection, thusly became heavier and heavier. So a trend you're going to see when I go into specific pieces is that armor kept getting smaller and smaller, while, of course, becoming thicker in order to protect against firearms. So, for example, you have this particular piece here. This is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And if you look at the piece's left shoulder, just on the breastplate right next to the left shoulder, you'll see a dent there. That is caused by a bullet. This thing was struck by a bullet shortly after it was made, and more than likely it was actually not done in the heat of battle. More than likely, it was created by an armorer who was proving that his armor was of high quality, that it was actually capable of stopping bullets. Hence the term bulletproof. For that dent is proof that this guy's armor can in fact stop a bullet. Armor continued to shrink in size but increase in thickness as firearms improved, until eventually firearms were powerful enough that they could pretty much cut through more or less any type of armor, or at least any type of armor that could be practically worn. And eventually by the 18th century, armor had more or less been eliminated from the equipment of a standard soldier. There were French cuirassiers who continued, and other cuirassiers as well, cavalrymen that continued to use armor plating all the way up through until World War I, really. But we're really not going to get into that. All right, since now we got the how and why out of the way, let's go into the what. So first off, we have this here. This is Maximilian plate armor. While this particular era in history is a time of transition, things were pretty slow in doing so, and this really represents the last gasp of knights in full plate armor, providing men on horseback, providing their own equipment, and being completely encased head to toe in metal. It's referred to as Maximilian armor because of its association with the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, who was one of the first people to wear this type of armor, or quite possibly one of his successors, Maximilian II, who was one of the last people to use this particular type of armor. This particular armor is most prominently known for the fluting you see on it. You see all the ridges that are carved into the breastplate, as well as the other sections. You see it on the sabatons, on the foot armor, on the leg armor, and pretty much every section of it has this fluting, those ridges that are manufactured into the armor. Now, this provides several benefits to the wearer. First off, it strengthens the armor while at the same time not increasing the amount of metal. Normally, you would just have to make the metal thicker or use a higher quality metal, but this fluting actually makes it much more rigid and therefore providing more protection while in no way adding to the weight, which is always beneficial. The other thing, though, is that it actually looks pretty cool, and that actually was a feature of this particular style of armor, or why this fluting was there, in that it mimicked the ruffled style of clothing that was popular during that era. You have to understand that during the Middle Ages and the era immediately afterwards, people were obsessed over their status and their standing within society, so having armor that looked fashionable and looked cool was almost as important as it being protective. So oftentimes when we study history, we're looking very closely at the paradigm. What does this say about society? Or, when we're talking about weapons, how effective is it? Or in this case, armor, how effective is the armor? You have to remember, because something looks cool is a completely valid reason for somebody to do something. And this is one of those reasons. Although this armor was of exquisite quality, it had the downside of being exquisitely expensive. And due to the other changes that I described earlier, it really just seems to be the last major type of full plate armor that would be available to the European knights. Eventually they would transition into a smaller type known as the 3/4 plate, which you see here. So you have many different types of 3/4 plate armor, but basically it is the same as knight's armor. It's more or less covers most of your body, except the lower portion of your leg, which would be exposed, hence the name 3/4, because 3/4 of your body would be covered by the armor, and 1/4, or the lower part of your leg, would be exposed. This particular piece here is actually extremely ornate, and it should be, because this is fit for a king, namely Henry VIII. When he wasn't closing down monasteries or beheading his queens, this is what he would wear in battle. Here is a much simpler version. Again, it's the same one we saw earlier with the dent in it. But yes, it is 3/4 plate armor. If you'll notice, the lower leg is exposed, and that would be protected by leather boots, which would usually be knee-high or sometimes even longer. If you'll notice, the legs are articulated, which allowed ease of movement, especially for cavalrymen. This is important because you got to be able to mount and dismount your horse, and you have to be able to do so quickly and effectively. And this would be the premier type of cavalry armor throughout the 16th and into the 17th century. And this is one of the most famous pieces of artwork depicting 3/4 plate. This is Night, Death, and the Devil by Albrecht Dürer. I'm sure you've probably seen this before. In any case, if you'll notice the knight, the figure in the center there, he is completely covered in armor. He's got, plate armor. I think that's a sallet helm on his head, which is kind of an earlier medieval design, but it was still around in the early 1500s. This particular painting was done in 1513, I want to say. That's when it was painted, or the engraving was done. Any case, he's completely encased in armor. If you'll notice from his leg down, he doesn't have any greaves, though, or any sabatons on his feet. So he is basically wearing three-quarter plate. This is a perfect example of that. As the centuries went on, armor eventually would disappear from infantrymen and artillerymen, but cavalrymen would continue to use them, mostly in the form of cuirassiers, as you see here. The French were particularly famous for this, using metal armored soldiers all the way up to World War I, when the realities of modern warfare made it obvious that this was far, far out of date. So while cavalrymen were being issued three-quarters armor to protect themselves, infantry had to make do with much reduced sizes. What you see here is a particular type of munitions grade armor. It was known as Almain plate. Almain being the old name for Germany, and I think it's actually still in French. Almain or Allemand or whatever it is still the French word for Germany. In any case, this particular type of armor was very popular in, well, what is now Germany, was the Holy Roman Empire at that time, and it spread to the rest of Europe from that point on. This particular kind of armor was very popular in the 16th and into the 17th centuries. This particular piece here is a 16th century. I believe it is a Swiss piece. And as you can see here, it does not have nearly the same amount of protection as the three-quarter plates. Actually, I don't know if they ever put a number attached to this, but this would be, I guess you could say, a half plate. Since instead of being protected from the knee down, you're pretty much, it comes down to roughly your mid-thigh. As far as armor is concerned, the shoulders are protected and the armor extends down to just above the elbow. If you look at the head, instead of having a helmet that completely encloses the head, the face is exposed, and there's also a distinct lack of any kind of bever or gorget, and the throat would, of course, be exposed as well. The limbs, or what you see of the limbs, they are articulated, which does allow ease of motion. However, they have to sacrifice protection for economics. This is another form of pikeman's armor. This is from the 17th century, roughly around the time of the 30 Years' War, I think a little bit before that. But if you'll notice here, the armor that protects the leg, it comes down to the upper thigh, maybe mid-thigh, but it is not nearly as extensive as the type of armor that was before that. And armor protecting the arms is completely missing, and the helmet is completely open-faced. It protects the crown of the head and, just the upper portion of your head, but otherwise leaves the rest of it exposed. So as the centuries wore on, it became less and less fiscally possible for armies to be able to provide for all of its soldiers, and so armor became smaller and smaller until eventually it would completely disappear. Alright, so next up is not metal armor, but you have what you see here, which is known as a buff coat. Now, a buff coat is a coat made of leather or buffalo hide, hence the name, and it's also a reference to the particular color, the brownish yellow that you see here. The buff coat was a replacement for the gambeson, the thick padded cloth that would be common in use throughout the Middle Ages, and also as a replacement for the arming doublet, which is a cloth garment that would be worn underneath metal armor in order to protect the skin and to provide padding against incoming blows. Although it's not nearly as protective as metal armor, the thick leather was actually pretty tough and actually was able to withstand slashes from swords, and could occasionally turn aside a sword thrust or a pike thrust, although it was particularly vulnerable to thrusting attacks. And of course, bullets would go absolutely right through this. Although if there was a bullet at the extreme end of its range, the buff coat, if it was thick enough and tough enough, could actually stop a bullet that was about to drop out of the sky anyway. The buff coat would occasionally be used as standalone armor, although more often than not it would be used underneath more traditional metal armor. You see here, this is armor for King Pedro II of Portugal. He started his reign in 1683, which is roughly the time the buff coat was popular. It's in the mid to later parts of the 17th century and into the 18th century. Buff coats would be used on occasion by infantrymen, particularly the officers, but more often than not they would be used by cavalrymen. Specifically, a type of cavalryman known as a harquebusier, which was a type of cavalryman that used carbines, or basically short-barreled muskets, most likely wheel-lock muskets, later on flintlocks, and they would, stand and trade with the enemy, basically exchange gunfire with the enemy, rather than charging home directly, which was the job for the cuirassiers. So in addition to talking about the buff code, I just want to take a moment here to talk about the state of armor at this point in history. Now this is, again, like I said, for King Pedro II, who reigned from 1683 until 1706. And as the king, he would be the most protected person on the battlefield. And the metal armor pretty much covers the head, but his face is still exposed, and his chest. And of one arm, I have no idea why only one arm is there. I didn't really look it up all that much, and I'm not really that interested. This is a brief overview, not an extensive, detailed survey. In any case, his arms are more or less completely exposed. His neck is completely exposed. His face is exposed, and pretty much his entire body from his waist down is completely exposed. And he's the most protected person on the battlefield. So really, this shows that by this point in history, armor was more or less on its way out. Now, breastplates would be used, like I said, cuirassiers would be used all the way up until World War I. However, really, at this point, having a breastplate was almost a status symbol. Generals, field marshals, or in this case, the king, would have the armor as a badge of office, just a sign to show how important they are on the battlefield, and more or less, it had lost any real protective value. It was simply economically unfeasible, and muskets and artillery, especially artillery, at this point was so effective that wearing armor was really more of a liability, or if it wasn't a liability, it simply wasn't nearly as helpful. Yes, it would work in close quarter combat, but that was happening less and less often. Now, I just want to take this moment to talk about some helmet types that were popular during this particular era. What you see here is one of the most famous and iconic from the 15 and 1600s. This is the Morion helmet. It was created in the early 16th century in the Kingdom of Castile in modern-day Spain, and is associated with the conquistadors in their conquests of the New World. It is a development of the kettle helm, which was very popular during the Middle Ages, and you can see it has a lot of that features there with its wide brim. Its most distinctive feature is the comb, or that big crest going down the center of it. That provides a great deal of protection and strength. It's kind of like the fluting in the Maximilian plate you saw earlier. Same idea there. It provides strength without adding all that much weight to it. It was very popular among infantrymen, and although it originally started in Spain, after a couple decades of use there, it became popular throughout Europe. Although the face of the Morion was often exposed, this could be mitigated with the use of cheek plates, which could often be detached. Related to the Morion is the Cabasset helm, which is what you see here. It's very similar in design. You can see it has the brim on it, very similar to the kettle helm, of which it shares a similar origin. And this is an Italian design as opposed to a Spanish design. However, it did in fact spread to the rest of Europe. And this was actually one of the more popular types of helm, again, by the English and the Puritans when they came to the New World, and especially the Plymouth colony in what is now Massachusetts. They brought several of these with them. You can see that it actually does have the ridge, very similar to the Morion helmet. It's got the crest on it. However, it's built in as a single piece rather than a crest that is added on top. So it's not nearly as prominent, but it is certainly there, and you can definitely see the similarities between the two. So the last piece of armor that I'm going to be talking about today is the 3-bar helm, or the lobster pot helm. What you see there is the one particular version of it. There are many, many different types of versions of it with various different attachments to it, and I'll be showing a couple of them in a few moments. It was very popular in the 17th and into the early 18th century. It was the common type of helmet used by arquebusiers and other cavalrymen, especially during the English Civil War and the 30 Years' War, and it was also the preferred helmet type of the winged hussars, who, well, were the winged hussars. Now, there were many different versions of it, but generally they all have the same thing in common. Mostly you have an open face, and more or less it sits on top of the head, more or less the same dimensions as a baseball cap. But it has, protecting the face, these 3 bars here, though there are some versions that only have 2 bars, but, same idea though. And that is to protect against sword slashes, though, of course, a thrust will go clean through it because, that doesn't offer a lot of coverage there. Also, it is referred to as a lobster pot helm because of what you see here. This is the protection on the back of the neck. It was articulated, and it looks like the tail of a lobster because, creativity is not particularly important when it comes to naming things. This particular piece here has a cheek plate, which protects, the cheek and specifically around the ear area, but the rest of the face is exposed. The piece that you saw before this did not have any cheek plate at all. This also only has 1 bar, a single bar going down the center of the face, right in front of the nose, which provides limited protection as opposed to the 3 bars, or again, there are also 2-bar examples. There are examples without the cheek plate, but 2 bars, and there are 3 bars with the cheek plate, and Some of them have longer tails, lobster type tails on the back. Some of them have shorter tails, larger plates, shorter plates that are articulated within one another, and just really a whole host of different varieties. It really depends on the particular era and the manufacturer and honestly the economy at the time. How much detail did the person who was, or the government that was spending this, how much did they want to spend, and a whole bunch of other factors that I'm not going to get into because I really am not an expert on this subject, and it's way beyond the scope of my capabilities and the scope of this video. Now, if you were to look at the lobster pot helm here, you would see that it does not provide a tremendous amount of protection. The head is protected and the neck is protected, but more or less the face and a significant portion of the head is exposed. And this is just like armor, just like body armor, in that it continued to shrink in size until eventually it fell out of use altogether. And during the 18th and 19th centuries, armor would more or less be abandoned altogether, until it would be revived again with the use of metal helmets during World War I. So that is it for the video. I tried to make this as brief as possible. I'm trying to cover, 200, 300 years of history here, and I want to do it in under 20 minutes. Unfortunately for me, I missed it by 1 minute, but I just don't feel like editing anymore. But yeah, unfortunately, I did have to leave some stuff out, so this is by no means extensive, and I'm sure there are plenty, I know there are plenty of types of armor, plenty of different types of helmets, and a lot of information that I did miss, but then again, this is just a brief overview for people who are completely new to this particular subject. So just to give you just kind of a base to jump off from in case you want to, research any further, just give, kind of a brief overview type thing, not particularly detailed. Any case, I hope you found this interesting and entertaining nonetheless. Please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos from me will be coming out whenever I get around to it. And have a glorious day. Or don't have a glorious day. You're adults. You can have any kind of day you want. See you later.